The decision to enlist was born of economic dust. It came from the high-altitude isolation of a failing Wyoming ranch. This was less an act of patriotism than a desperate, pivotal rite of passage. The author carried the vast, indifferent emptiness of the American West within him. He felt the quiet disillusionment of a family dream that had withered. He yearned for a life defined by something other than endless sagebrush and paralyzing winter. The Navy, in March 1941, offered the ultimate structure. It was a world diametrically opposed to the impractical chaos of the ranch. That journey, from the blizzard-choked plains to the shocking warmth of San Diego, was a psychological crossing of the line. The training that followed was designed not merely to teach skills, but to eradicate the former self. It was a crucible of noise and discipline, where individuality was not tolerated but actively suppressed. Recruits were forced to put their individuality in storage. The transition was absolute. They moved from the boundless horizons of nature to the claustrophobic, metal-walled order of a war machine. Cleanliness was enforced with evangelical fervor. Every movement was a collective, shouted cadence. The education provided by the fleet was brutal, immediate, and utterly essential. The Navy, in its harsh wisdom, provided the structure that isolated life had denied him. It taught survival, not through self-reliance against nature, but through absolute dependence on the man next to you. The war itself became the ultimate unwritten curriculum. It was the Blue Jackets Manual, chapters O to Z. This series of experiential lessons civilian life could never replicate. They learned the stark difference between the romantic ideal of combat and the pervasive, pathological grind of naval life. Long, agonizing stretches of boredom were punctuated by brief, terrifying moments. Death arrived in a flash of anti-aircraft fire or the shuddering impact of a torpedo. He witnessed the technical incompetence of early American weaponry, specifically the notorious ineffective torpedoes. This contrasted sharply with the sheer, terrifying precision of the enemy. He felt the sickening lurch of a carrier taking a hit. He endured the pervasive stench of burning wool and fuel oil. There was the constant, abrasive irritation of sandy saltwater soap, a daily reminder of the miserable conditions. This confrontation with death stripped away the last vestiges of youthful naivety. It came in the form of a catastrophic catapult launch into the Pacific. It came with the loss of his pilot and radioman. It came with the ambiguous, chaotic end of a celebrated ace like Butch O'Hare. The war was a relentless, messy affair of human error, flawed equipment, and profound, irreducible loss. It fundamentally reshaped his perspective. It hardened his understanding of reality. He came to reject the comforts of abstract belief in favor of a fierce, hard materialism. Yet out of that terror, a profound appreciation emerged that navigated the oily, slippery hangar decks. He had endured the relentless heat rash that had lived with the tightly controlled fear of death as a constant companion. The author gained a startling clarity. The intense pressure of wartime existence fostered an appreciation for what he called the dullness and pain of peacetime. The vast military machine was either operating at maximum RPMs or waiting in anxious repose. The war, in its totality, was the completion of his education. It forged a resilience and adaptability that would define his life long after the Enterprise had been left behind, that traded the isolation of the ranch for the ultimate camaraderie. In doing so, he had found his purpose in the crucible of global conflict. The period between the devastation of Pearl Harbor and the pivotal summer of 1942 was a desperate scramble for the U.S. Navy. It was defined by the humiliating realization that the age of the battleship was dead. American strategy now rested entirely on a handful of aircraft carriers. These vessels were plagued by technical flaws. Their commanders were still learning the lethal calculus of modern warfare. The only true advantage the fleet possessed was invisible. It was the tireless work of cryptographers who had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25. This intelligence, known as magic, provided the crucial narrow window into Admiral Yamamoto's plans for the invasion of Midway. The tension aboard the Enterprise in the final days of May was not merely fear, it was a corrosive, keyed-up anticipation. The ship vibrated intensely as it operated at near maximum engine RPMs. The noise was a constant, physical assault that made deep sleep impossible. Adding to the unease was the sudden, ominous departure of Admiral Halsey, sidelined by a severe allergic rash. Command of Task Force 16 was handed to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a battleship veteran, untried and untested in the brutal, fast-moving world of carrier warfare. The men knew the stakes. They were the last remaining offensive fist the U.S. had in the Pacific. June 4th dawned with the launch of the American airstrikes. Despite the strategic intelligence that guided their approach, the execution was chaotic. The dive bombers, flying high, missed their rendezvous, as left the slow, obsolete Douglas Devastators, the TBD torpedo planes, to fly unsupported.
They flew directly into the enemy's anti-aircraft fire and the relentless Japanese Zero fighters.
It was a staggering, unmitigated slaughter. The narrator's own unit, Torpedo Squadron 6, or VT-6, flew directly into the inferno. Of the 14 aircraft that launched, only 5 returned. 9 planes, carrying 18 men pilots and gunners, vanished into the vast blue water within minutes. This brutal, immediate introduction to combat left a cold shock in its wake. The survivors were not merely traumatized, they were consumed by a visceral anger. This anger was directed not only at the ineffective torpedoes that failed to explode, it was aimed at the perceived failure of the fighter escorts who had, in the confusion, turned back. The human cost of this first wave was catastrophic. It was a price paid by the enlisted men who had been sent on what amounted to a suicide mission. Yet, the turning point was not a planned maneuver. It was a desperate, fuel-guzzling gamble. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the dive bombers, was running low on fuel and dangerously far afield. Ignoring the protocol that would have seen him return to the carrier, he extended his search pattern northeast. It was a single, audacious decision that delivered salvation. He found the Japanese carriers at the absolute worst possible moment for them. Their decks were loaded with armed and fueled aircraft. Their engines were warming for a second strike. The ensuing dive bomber attack was swift, devastating, and absolute. The Japanese carriers, caught in a moment of extreme vulnerability, erupted in flames. By sunset, 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were cripples. They were sinking into the Pacific abyss. The victory at Midway was born of code-breaking, sheer luck, and Japanese overconfidence. It was also secured by the sacrificial courage of the torpedo crews. The shifting balance of power in the Pacific had just sounded. It was a brutal lesson that the future of naval warfare belonged not to flawless execution. It belonged to improvisation, intelligence, and the willingness of ordinary men to fly headlong into certain death. The myth of American invincibility had been buried at Pearl Harbor. The myth of Japanese naval supremacy was now sinking into the deep water off Midway Atoll. The war in the Pacific had just begun its long, bloody reverse. The victory at Midway was not a reprieve. It was merely the opening bell for a sustained, brutal slugfest in the South Pacific. The strategic focus immediately shifted to the Solomon Islands. This meant the brutal fight for Guadalcanal. The campaign demanded immense personal sacrifice and exposed the profound vulnerabilities of the U.S. Navy. The relentless Japanese offensive, determined to disrupt the American foothold, led to a series of devastating surface engagements. These battles were fought in the confined, black waters off the island. American cruisers, ill-equipped for night combat, suffered grievously. They often succumbed to the superior Japanese long-lance torpedoes or, tragically, to friendly fire. The area soon became known by its grim, definitive moniker, Iron Bottom Bay. It became a permanent graveyard of American and Japanese warships. This period of attrition warfare culminated in the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942. The loss of the USS Hornet, following extensive damage to the USS Enterprise, was a catastrophic blow. It left the United States with only one operational fleet carrier in the entire South Pacific. This was the strategic low point, a moment of profound psychological and material crisis. The final bitter irony of the Hornet's loss was infuriating. American destroyers could not sink their own crippled carrier due to the repeated failure of their inept torpedoes. This stood as a stark symbol of the technological deficiencies that plagued the fleet. Survival required immediate, often dangerous tactical innovation. As Japanese bombers exploited the darkness for night attacks, the Navy scrambled to develop a defense. The Black Panther operation was the first nighttime fighter action in naval history. It was an experimental, high-stakes gamble. Pilots flew blind, guided by primitive airborne radar sets. They relied on split-second decisions in a disorienting void. It was a terrifying evolution of carrier aviation. The darkness magnified the risk of catastrophic error and friendly fire. Having survived the chaos of the Solomons and the gut-wrenching experience of being sunk, the narrator shifted away from combat. He entered the bureaucratic limbo of the V5 pilot training program. He found this routine utterly suffocating. The Navy, now flush with a surplus of pilots, had stretched the training into a seemingly endless, dull routine of ground school and repetitive maneuvers. He craved the structure of action. He rejected the manufactured glamour of the academy for the immediate, high-consequence reality of the front line. The constant shouting of inexperienced officers and the endless, pointless exercises intensified his disillusionment. He had sought structure, but found only stagnation. His decision to resign from the V5 program was a conscious choice. He traded safety for purpose. He returned to the active fleet as an aerial gunner, assigned to Torpedo Squadron 40, VT-40. He served aboard the USS WWII, an escort carrier described as an awkward, slow, unattractive old waddler. The immediate return to the theatre of war was a visceral shock. His transition was punctuated by the enduring confusion and psychological fallout of chaotic combat. This was particularly true regarding the fate of celebrated ace Butch O'Hare. The engagement had been a maelstrom of friendly fire, primitive technology, and blurred vision. It ended with O'Hare's plane slipping beneath Cayman's own in the darkness, followed by an ambiguous splash. The sheer disorientation of the night fight left a lingering, corrosive guilt. Cayman had struggled with his gun sight, blinded by the muzzle flash of his own tracers. The subsequent media frenzy sought a clean, heroic narrative, contrasted sharply with the messy reality he had experienced and the uncertainty that haunted him. He had seen firsthand how heroism and tragedy could become hopelessly entangled in the fog of war. It was this immediate, demanding reality he embraced. Just days after boarding the Suwannee, a defective retaining ring during a catapult launch plunged his plane into the ocean. Rescued by the plane guard, the USS Massey, he was violently reminded that the threat of death was constant. Death could be delivered by a Japanese torpedo or a faulty piece of American engineering, that this was the world he preferred. It was one of immediate consequences. The grinding fear of combat was preferable to the grinding, bureaucratic boredom of the academy. His education in the brutal, unflinching nature of survival continued unabated. The final year of the war was an exercise in pure, corrosive fatalism. The relentless intensity of kamikaze attacks created a pervasive sense that survival was random chance, not skill. Every man understood that the next great inevitable moment of bloodshed was the invasion of the Japanese mainland. The expectation was not victory, but a horrific, endless slog. This slog would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. This grim anticipation fostered a deep, desperate yearning for the conflict to simply stop. When President Roosevelt died on April 13, 1945, the shock was profound. For many servicemen, he was the only commander-in-chief they had ever known. His sudden absence introduced an unnerving uncertainty into the war's trajectory. That the surrender of Germany in May offered a tangible sign of progress, the fear of the Japanese invasion remained the dominant psychological force. Salvation, when it arrived, came in the form of a single devastating flash. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were later fraught with moral complexity, but they were perceived by those waiting on the front lines as the direct, miraculous cause of their survival. It was the absolute end of the anticipated invasion. The author, who had witnessed too much cruelty and randomness, felt an immediate personal gratitude for the bomb. This sentiment would forever put him at odds with later academic perspectives. The war had stripped away his faith. It replaced it with a fierce, hard materialism. The myth that there are no atheists in foxholes had been thoroughly debunked by the sheer, arbitrary brutality of combat. The war's end, declared on August 13th, was not met with universal, roaring jubilation. It was met with profound relief and an overarching sense of anticlimax. And some ships fired their guns into the air. The author felt a strange, hollow nothingness. It was a profound quiet after years of existential noise. He witnessed the immense, heart-stirring scale of the Pacific Fleet assembled at Ulithi Atoll. It was a testament to American industrial might. Then he sailed into Japanese waters. At Nagasaki, the devastation was immediate, yet strangely familiar. It looked like any other bombed-out city. This made it difficult to comprehend that a single device had wrought such destruction. The naval base at Yokosuka presented a stark image of defeat, the sunken warships and leveled docks. The population seemed curiously friendly amid the ruin. The vast military machine, suddenly at rest, began the long, messy process of demobilization. Rules were suspended, officers were ignored. The Navy seemed to be falling apart, with everyone focused solely on the journey home. The author, however, faced a financial crisis. Nearly 5 years of service, marked by financial irresponsibility, had left him nearly broke. He had sent money home and gambled it away. He needed money to leverage the GI Bill's promise of $65 a month for living expenses. This was the only clear path to higher education and a different life. The final desperate gamble of the war was not fought in the air, but around a table, awaiting a direct ship home. He risked his entire civilian clothing allowance of $300. He entered a high-stakes poker game against sharks. These hard-bitten types treated money as a weapon and weakness as an invitation to defeat. In an act mirroring the fatalistic risk-taking of combat, he played with cold detachment. He played with the nerve of a man who had already faced death. Miraculously, he won over $3,000. This stake, won by chance and nerve, was the financial key that unlocked his future. His discharge, marked by the small symbolic ruptured duck lapel button, was physically uncomfortable, but psychologically liberating. The journey home included a visceral, flea-infested train ride. It culminated in a desperate, barefoot dash to a drugstore for relief. This underscored the inadequacy of the civilian world to handle the mass return of its warriors. The struggle to reintegrate highlighted a profound sense of alienation. The most telling moment came during a visit to Commander Phillips's widow. The author recognized an insurmountable barrier between them. The war had created a vague, troubling presence in his mind that could not be adequately articulated or shared. The experience of combat was the defining education of his life. Living under the constant threat of instant annihilation was hermetically sealed from the world he was returning to. Yet, this education in survival, in camaraderie, and in the brutal, unvarnished reality of human existence had forged the perspective that would define his life. Aided by the GI Bill and the desperately won funds from the poker table, the ordinary bluejacket from the Wyoming ranch could finally pursue the intellectual life he had yearned for. He transformed into the distinguished scholar who would eventually write the memoir. He provided a rare, unromanticized testament to the human cost and profound transformative power of the war.